Life on Earth is in crisis. Crop failure, social and ecological collapse, mass extinction. We have a moral duty to take action. These statements, made by Extinction Rebellion, reflect the climate alarmist narrative that has continued to escalate across the Western world. Hysteria over climate change can be seen throughout history, from the human sacrifices of the Aztecs to bring back rain, to the Salem witch trials to eliminate the women who they blamed for crop failure during the Little Ice Age. Today, the climate industrial complex is funded by trillions of dollars, seeking to control what we buy, eat, and where we are allowed to travel, all in the name of sustainability and achieving net zero carbon emissions. This fear campaign is rooted in the belief that we will not look into the data ourselves, but instead look to the governments and to the media to tell us what is true. Today, I will demonstrate that temperatures fluctuate and are not unprecedented, and that natural disasters are not getting worse. I will also highlight the unreliability of climate data and the role of CO2. Ultimately, I will present scientific evidence to show that we are not in a climate crisis. Historical temperature records indicate that we are not in the climate crisis Western governments claim we are. Looking at a graph of the past 65 million years from Noah, the Earth today seems to be in a particularly cool period. In fact, the Earth is still coming out of an ice age. History demonstrates that life has existed and thrived in much warmer temperatures, and that temperatures have been much higher without the human influence of industrial CO2 emissions. Historical temperature records indicate that the temperature of the Earth naturally fluctuates over time, as it has for the past 65 million years. In just the past 2,000 years, there have been 2 warm periods and 2 cold periods. The Roman warm period, also called the Roman optimum, was known as a time of prosperity. This, of course, goes against the entire narrative that warming threatens human life. Following the Roman warm period came the Cold Dark Age, the Medieval warm period, and the Little Ice Age. The current warming from 1800 onwards is the warming of recovery from the Little Ice Age. However, temperatures are still cold compared to distant times and continue to visibly fluctuate. Given this evidence, the 3 degrees Fahrenheit that scientists and news pundits claim is the end of civilization is not cause for alarm because it is not unprecedented and because temperatures will continue to fluctuate. Today, the argument for climate change is rooted in the belief that warmer weather and CO2 emissions have been causing natural disasters to become more frequent and more violent. However, after studying hurricane and wildfire data, it became clear that actual activity goes against this global warming narrative. This graph from the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society shows the number of hurricanes in the U.S. per year since 1900, showing a slight downward trend for the past 120 years. The strength and duration of hurricanes shows a similar lack of crises. A graph from the National Hurricane Research Laboratory illustrates the North Atlantic hurricane intensity from 1920 to 2016, where there is evidently no trend. However, the data presented to the public by the 2014 National Climate Assessment of the United States is limited to the portion highlighted in red, creating an illusory upward trend. This graph, starting in 1920, shows that the number of acres burned by wildfires in the U.S. has been decreasing. Similarly, the number of acres burned globally since 1900 has steadily declined as well. Ultimately, the presented evidence goes against the narrative that anthropogenic CO2 emissions has been making the weather worse. To understand the science behind the climate crisis claims of today, it is necessary to highlight the unreliability of available data. This is most evident in the disparity between climate model predictions and the observed data. In this graph illustrating temperature change, the blue line represents data taken from weather balloons, matching up well with the green line, which represents data taken from satellites. However, the red line represents the climate model used by the UN IPCC to predict future global warmings. These observations show that actual warming is about 1/3 of what is predicted. Temperature measurements are greatly affected by what is called the urban heat island effect. Since concrete picks up heat, temperatures taken in cities are much higher than those taken in rural areas. For example, in a thermal radiation map of the city of Paris, the middle of the city produces a deep red color representing heat, while the rural areas around the city project a green to blue color representing milder temperatures. This gap represents one way that climate alarmists can instill fear by embellishing data to serve their agenda. Perhaps the greatest tool of the climate industrial complex is the supposed evil of CO2. However, CO2 is not the control knob for climate change, mainly because it is only 0.04% of the atmosphere. I'll say it again, CO2 is only 0.04% of the atmosphere. In a visual comparison of CO2 to the other atmospheric gases, it shows how barely negligible the gas is in comparison. Although the mainstream media has tried to alarm its consumers with the accelerating emissions of CO2, the Earth is actually in a CO2 famine. Current levels are about 423 parts per million. However, in the past they have been at least 1,000 parts per million and have likely reached 8,000 parts per million. While the narrative states that CO2 directly causes the rise in temperature, it has been found that quite the opposite is true. The relationship between CO2 and temperature is not that more CO2 causes a rise in temperature, but that a rise in temperature causes an increase in CO2. Carl Wunsch, professor of oceanography at MIT, found that when the ocean warms, more CO2 is released into the atmosphere. On the other hand, when the ocean is cold, CO2 is absorbed into the water. In a graphical correlation between temperature and CO2, it is found that when a rise in temperature occurs, a rise in CO2 follows a few centuries later. In this graph, CO2 rose 800 years later in response to a surge in temperature. While CO2, like everything else in the world, may have some small factor in climate, there are countless of other factors affecting temperature. Some examples are volcanic activity, cosmic rays, and the sun. This highlights how if we were to limit CO2, it would only stunt biodiversity while having almost no effect on temperature because of the fact that it is only one small factor in a sea of greater causes. Some call CO2 the gas of life because it plays an instrumental role in the process of photosynthesis. It comes as no surprise that most farmers use high levels of it in their greenhouses to produce a better crop. In this picture, 4 pine trees are shown growing at different levels of added CO2, from normal atmospheric CO2 to an added 150, 300, and eventually 450 parts per million. More CO2 is evidently beneficial for plant growth. Physicist Lubos Model, former professor at Harvard, summarized the importance of CO2 in saying, "It is the key compound that plants need to grow, and indirectly that every organism needs to have food at the end. It is clear that CO2 is not, as the New York Times frighteningly put, a tiny bit of arsenic or cobra venom, nor will it cause famine, as many claim. If CO2 increases, it will only green the planet and increase the food supply." Across the Western world, climate change has been coined as an existential threat to mankind. While this sentiment is not new over the course of history, as it can be seen through the Aztecs and even in the Salem witch trials, it has once again become relevant in today's culture. With policies such as carbon taxes and individual CO2 budgets being proposed in our governments, we begin to see the climate issue creep into every part of our lives. This is why I found it necessary to pursue the truth in the climate debate. In my speech, I presented the scientific evidence behind historical temperature change and natural disasters, discovering the unreliability of climate data and the small role of CO2 in climate and its essential role in biodiversity. As a result, I've concluded that the climate crisis is a hoax that we must arm ourselves against by pursuing the truth and by looking into the data ourselves.